What's going on, guys? It's Cimoooooooo. So today I'm bringing you a video on how to beat Sky Strikers. Recently we just did a video as an introduction to Sky Strikers, giving you guys a bit of an overview of how the cards work and some simple interactions between the cards. But today, since we're going full speed ahead into Nationals format, I thought it would be an excellent idea to bring you a video talking about some cards and strategies to help you in your Sky Striker matchup. But before we get into that, I want to give a huge shout out to my newest patrons as always. So big shout outs today to Vincent as well as Darkins Dancer. You guys are the reason that this channel is growing strong. And if you guys want to help support me in the channel through Patreon, then check out the Patreon link in the description below. But without further ado, let's go ahead and get right into it. So we're going to start off with one of the main ways to cripple Sky Strikers, and that is going after their searching. One of the reasons why Sky Strikers is just one of the most powerful decks moving into the Nationals format is because it's so consistent and just has the ability to search almost its entire archetype multiple times over in a single turn, and that's due in part to Sky Striker Engage. The fact that this card is not once per turn and it's easily recurable through several different means is just insane, and that's really where the heart and soul of the deck lies. So if we can play some cards to kind of help stop the searchability of this deck and essentially pretty much cut off the deck's ability to gather and obtain resources, that's going to be very good for us. So I think the best card to probably play against the deck is Shared Ride. Definitively, like, this is an OCG staple in the side deck at 3. Shared Ride is basically Max C that was hand-tailored for Sky Striker. If you guys remember, people were playing this during Necroz's format for pretty much the exact same reason. Anytime your opponent would search and add a card from deck or graveyard to hand, that's also very notable as well, this card is going to allow you to draw one card. Now, the thing is, Sky Striker is never going to kill you in a given turn, especially if you're on 8,000 life points. That's just not how the deck works. The way Sky Strikers essentially wins its matches is by simply out-resourcing its opponent, and then you're just poking in with your Sky Striker monsters, or maybe a Diabolos, depending on the type of build that you're playing, and that's what's very different compared to the OCG, where the OCG actually has an OTK, which makes it a lot different. So Shared Ride really puts the pressure on your opponent because it really puts them in that no-win situation, because if they elect to keep adding cards from their deck or graveyard to hand, you're drawing a card every single time they do that, and that's pretty much taking them further and further away from their actual win condition. But if they don't add any cards from deck to hand and pretty much just stop, that's also good for you, because then that means they're not going to essentially set up in whatever means is possible, and that means on your next turn you can pretty much just go in and try to OTK them if your deck is able to do that. I mean, it's very awkward when your opponent summons a Kagari, tries to add a card from grave to hand, and then you change Shared Ride, because now they're going to get to draw a card, they're going to add a card back that they may not want to use because it might give you another card, and then they might not want to go into that end phase Shizuku because that's also going to give them another card, and so it really just puts them in this awkward position that they don't want to be in. I think Shared Ride is probably going to be in every side deck moving forward as long as Sky Strikers is in the format, and if you haven't already got your copies, I would highly recommend you do so. Now conversely, if we're not trying to play the resource game, if we're trying to just cut off our opponent's resources entirely, we can play a card like Droll and Lockbird. Now, I'm kind of iffy on Droll and Lockbird because while it pretty much denies them from being able to search for the duration of the turn, the thing is Sky Strikers is kind of okay with that, because if your deck isn't able to OTK them, then what are you really accomplishing? Because on their next turn, especially with some of the cards they have at their disposal like Afterburner, Widow Anchor, all these other things, they're just going to keep going and do what they would have done otherwise if you hadn't played the Droll and Lockbird. So I think it's one of those cards that if your deck is able to consistently OTK through a board like that, then maybe Droll and Lockbird might be the card for you, but it's very dependent on the type of deck that you're playing. If you're playing a control deck, I would not recommend Droll and Lockbird in the slightest, because realistically you're taking a minus and you're not really gaining anything out of it. You can also play a card like Mistake, which is basically Droll and Lockbird, except it pretty much just lasts indefinitely until it gets removed from the field. It's an alright option as well, but again, kind of has the same issue where it can be easily taken out by removal. I mean, there's cards like Twin Twister and Mystical Space Typhoon, which are pretty much played in abundance in the Sky Striker decks anyway to synergize with the field spell, so that kind of works to double up and take out a card like Mistake, but it's another option nonetheless. Now, another way that Sky Strikers essentially function is by not having monsters in the main monster zone. If you look at a majority of the Sky Striker spell cards, this is how these cards, essentially the condition they need to follow if they want to activate. So if we're able to put monsters in our opponent's main monster zone, that pretty much just fucks them up entirely, and it's almost going to shut down all of their disruption potential or their ability to do anything while a monster exists in that zone. Past regionals, there was actually a Lost World Dinosaur player that managed to, I believe, take the top 8 cut because he was playing a Lost World Dinosaur build, and basically he would just activate Lost World, summon a dinosaur, give his opponent a token, and basically none of these Sky Striker players are playing Link Kuriboh, which is pretty much the only way to realistically get rid of that monster on its own because it's level 1, but even then, if they don't draw a hand trap or something to summon in tandem with it, or maybe like Ray to make a Link 2, that's the only way they're able to clear that Lost World token, and that's how this player said he won a majority of his Sky Striker matches. So while the theory is there, I don't necessarily think that strategy is something that could be effectively and consistently replicated, but I think the theory is very good. So how can we replicate that without exactly playing a Lost World Dinosaur deck? Well, Kaijus happen to fit the bill here very well, because not only are you removing the monster from their extra monster zone, you're putting a monster in their main monster zone, which immediately shuts down all of their back row, like their Widow Anchors and things like that. But also, if they used a Sky Striker Ace Ray to summon their extra deck monster, it's not going to come back to the field because Ray needs to basically come back if the monster left the field because of a card effect. And Kaijuing your opponent's monster is not a card effect, it's just an inherent summon, so that means Ray also will not trigger as well. So Kaijus essentially fit the bill here and pretty much check all the boxes for anything you could ever want. Especially too because they're very diverse in other matchups. I expect Kaijus to start seeing a lot of play in side decks, hell, maybe even main decks. We'll just have to see what people come up with. But you know, there are instances where, you know, we can't get to Kaijus, or maybe that's something where we can't get a monster in our opponent's main monster zone. So what's the alternative? Well, we can go ahead and target their spells and traps that are set in their back row. One of the most popular things that Sky Striker players do is set a bunch of cards in their back row, thanks in part to Sky Striker multi-roll. Now, multi-roll is basically Spellbook of Judgment that allows them to set a bunch of cards back in their back row per the number of spells they activated in that turn while multi-roll was face up. So they can use a ton of spells, and then in the end phase, they can set a bunch of spells in their back row in preparation for your turn. Twin Twister is very good here because you're gonna know which cards they're setting in the back row, and that means you can just use Twin Twister, snipe them out before you do any of your plays, and thanks to multi-roll, Twin Twister will actually banish those cards, meaning it's going to lower the spell count of the spells in their graveyard, meaning they might not gain their bonus effects on your opponent's next turn. So that's a very good option there. You might want to opt to play something like Heavy Stormduster if you're playing a deck like Altergeist, but it's kind of better to be proactive here rather than reactive because Heavy Stormduster could be used in a much different way than, say, something like Twin Twister. But Twin Twister is very good going first or second, which is why I recommended it first. But you also have the ultimate back row killer in Evenly Matched. Evenly Matched can just completely decimate all of the Sky Striker players' back row, especially if they decide to really overcommit on a multi-roll and set like 4 cards in the back row. That is one of the most satisfying feelings you could possibly have. Now the thing is, there is another way to kind of attack the Sky Striker strategy, and that is by going after the spell cards in the graveyard or prevent them from going in the graveyard in the first place. Now, Retaliating Sea is a card that's seen some popularity in the OCG because when your opponent activates Sky Striker Hornet drones, you can chain Retaliating Sea, and now since it's on your field, it basically acts as a walking macrocosmos, banishing every card that would go to the graveyard, meaning your opponent won't get their spell count up to 3 and won't be able to essentially recur any of their spell cards with something like Kagari. The thing is though, I don't know if Retaliating Sea is going to see nearly as much play as it does in the OCG because they have max C at 3 and we have it at 0. So one of the benefits here is that you can go ahead and add a max C when Retaliating Sea is destroyed, and that's pretty damn good. But since we can't do that, I'm not sure if Retaliating Sea will see nearly as much play. If you're playing a deck that doesn't care about the graveyard, you could just opt for the 1 copy of Macrocosmos. That's also pretty good, and hey, if your deck can incorporate a card like Dark Law, absolutely go for it. It's a walking macrocosmos. It can rip cards out of your opponent's hand, and if they don't have an afterburner, they're going to be in a very awkward position. So, not the best option, but, hey, if you can get to a Dark Law consistently, then you're going to be in a pretty good position. Now, last but not least, I just wanted to touch on some generic cards that, don't really fall into a particular category, but discuss why these cards are effective. Ghost Reaper and Winter Cherries is probably one of the best hand traps against this deck, because you can use it to pretty much take out their Kagari, in some cases Shizuku, but I think Kagari's better because it's always going to be recurring from the graveyard, and the options in the graveyard are particularly better, especially as the game goes on, where Shizuku gets particularly weaker as the game progresses. Shizuku's kind of like a good starter card, but after that it kind of loses its validity, because once there's more spells in the grave, Shizuku's going to have less targets to choose from. Ghost Reaper is also very good if your opponent decides to start with a Hornet Drones, because compared to Ray, they can't tag out into either one of their monsters. So that's very good and can pretty much just cut off the resource recursion engine. You've also got hand traps like Effect Veiler and Infinite Impermanence. Now, these cards have very, little use in comparison to some of these other cards, but being able to stop something like a Kagari from adding back an Engage, or an End-Phase Shizuku from adding back an Engage, knowing your opponent is going to target that because they specifically pretty much modulated their graveyard so that they don't have an Engage in grave, that can be a very good way to slow your opponent down and prevent them from having a good follow-up play on their next turn. Both of these cards have their advantages and disadvantages, so basically depending on the deck that you're playing, that's why you'd want to consider one or the other. There's also a card like Naturia Beast. If your deck can synchro into Naturia Beast rather consistently, they're pretty much not going to be able to do anything, because they're not going to have a way to pretty much out the Naturia Beast, because their only main deck out to Naturia Beast just so happens to be a spell card. So that would really screw them over. So if you can make some sort of Naturia Beast turbo variant, I would say go for it. There's also a card like Secret Village of the Spellcasters. Now, this is particularly dangerous because of the fact that Altergeists happen to all be spellcasters, meaning Altergeist could tech this card into their main decks, or even their side decks if they don't want to have it, depending on how prevalent Sky Strikers become. They can just summon an Altergeist monster, play Secret Village, set some back row, and the Sky Striker player is going to have a pretty difficult fucking time being able to play through that. So I really like Secret Village of the Spellcasters for that reason. And then wrapping up with some more generic trap cards, we've got Anti-Spell Fragrance and Imperial Order, which have basically done their job for any spell-heavy deck since the beginning of time. And then there's also Curse Seal of the Forbidden Spell, a card we haven't seen in quite some time, back since Nekroz format, hell, even Shadal format. This card can be particularly devastating against cards like Sky Striker Engage, being able to cut off their ability to search cards and draw cards. I mean, it doesn't even have to be used against Engage. Really, any spell card you don't want to see for the duration of the game, Curse Seal the Forbidden Spell will get you there. Now, it is a trap card and it does require you to discard a spell card, so it is a bit of a minus, but to be able to cripple their ability to just add cards continuously turn after turn, that just might be worth it. So, guys, I really hope you enjoyed this video. Let me know down in the comments what other cards you guys think would be particularly effective in the Sky Striker matchup. I'd really love to hear your thoughts. Guys, thank you so much for watching the video. Be sure to like the video as always. Subscribe to the channel for more amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content, and if you found this video helpful, consider backing me on Patreon, because just by pledging only $1 a month, you're investing in my ability to continue bringing you amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content. So thanks so much again, and we'll see you next time.